Wynne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, New Brunswickers have always been quick to answer the call of duty, in whatever form it came. The Canadian Armed Forces has a long and proud history of defending our interests abroad and working for the security and betterment of people around the world. Canadians hold their freedom dear. They often sacrifice themselves so that others can enjoy that same freedom. Conflict has always been on a spectrum, and for a long period of our recent history, we identified some missions as peacekeeping. Often, there was no peace to keep. There is no doubt that these missions came at a high personal cost to the men and women who served on them, and also to their families and loved ones. Today, we are joined by a group of these people, veterans and their families, who have sacrificed much so that we can enjoy the freedom that we have here. They sacrificed much so that people they have never met, generations of them, from all corners of the globe, can enjoy similar freedoms. In 1996, a group of retired peacekeepers met informally for fellowship, and they became involved in a few ceremonies pertaining to the United Nations. They decided to form an association of veteran peacekeepers, and in the spring of 1997, the Blue Helmets were born as a charitable organization. And the aims of the organization are to constitute an association for individuals who have served with United Nations forces, who have supported, by virtue of their employment, United Nations forces, and for individuals' partners. Also to bring about unity of all those who have served, to serve as a social focus and means of mutual assistance for members, to perpetuate the deeds and memories of those fallen who have lost their lives in the defense of freedom and peace, to keep the spirit and camaraderie alive of peacekeepers, to liaise with other organizations whose objects are similar, to pass on to their families and descendants the traditions for which they stand, and to engage only in activities which will be to the credit and benefit of Canadian communities, and will encourage and promote the positive reputation of our peacekeepers. The headquarters of the Blue Helmets is at the Military Museum at CFB Gagetown in Oromocto, where their colours are on display alongside various United Nations artifacts from various peacekeeping missions. Members are from various locations in Canada, with the majority being from the Maritime provinces, although they have 2 members in Ireland and 1 in Korea. It's worth noting that in December 1988, the Nobel Organization awarded peacekeepers worldwide the Nobel Peace Prize, and the peacekeepers being introduced today are recipients of that prestigious award. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by introducing Fred LeBlanc. A good friend of mine, Fred is originally from Moncton, resident here in Fredericton, and he served with the Royal Canadian Signals from 1953 to 1969, and in particular the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Congo, Africa in 1962. I'd also like to introduce Robert Billet. From St. John, New Brunswick, resident of Clifton Royal, he served with the Royal Canadian Dragoons from 1961 to 1968, with his peacekeeping mission in Cyprus in 1964. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader. Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I may, I want to join in government in welcoming these fine people to our legislature here today. Whenever I see men and women standing proud with that strip of medals across their chest, it makes me proud to be Canadian, Mr. Speaker. De la part de l'opposition officielle, je veux certainement souhaiter la bienvenue à tous les gens qui sont ici aujourd'hui, que le gouvernement a présenté en cette Chambre. Je pense que si nous avons les droits et les libertés que nous avons au Nouveau-Brunswick et au Canada, c'est grâce à ces gens ici, Monsieur le Président. Alors, je veux les souhaiter la bienvenue de la part de l'opposition officielle. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai ici parmi nous aujourd'hui M. Gilbert Soucy from Edmundston, New Brunswick, résident de Baker Brook. He served with the various units of the Canadian Armed Forces from 1955 to 1977. United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in Congo, Africa in 1962. M. Soucy est un musicien qui peut organiser ou agrémenter aussi vos soirées et une personne très dévouée pour la région. Bienvenue à M. Soucy.
Grand Lake, Gagetown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great honor to rise today to introduce three members from the riding of Grand Lake Gagetown, which are here today. Mr. Cy Carney was born in Jemseg, New Brunswick, is currently a resident of Newcastle Creek. Mr. Carney served with the Royal Canadian Signals and the Royal Canadian Engineer Mechanical and Electronics. Mr. Carney served in Korea from 1952 to 53 and United Nations peacekeeping missions in Cyprus from 79 to 80. Mr. Carney is also accompanied by his son Richard, and I know Richard is an avid member of the Royal Canadian Army Cadet Corps. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Fred Glant. Mr. Glant is originally born in Prince Edward Island. He's now a proud resident of the village of Gagetown, and he served with the Royal Canadian Artillery from 1964 to 1993. Mr. Glant also served on United Nations peacekeeping missions in Cyprus in 1975 and 1981, and Lebanon in 1990 and 1991, and also served in Syria and in Israel. Mr. Glant is also accompanied by his wife Diane. Mr. Speaker, we also have Ronald Richard from Minto. He is now a resident of Fredericton, but Mr. Richard served with the Royal Canadian Signals from 1956 to 1976, and he did United Nations peacekeeping missions in Egypt from 1957 to 58, the Congo from 1962 to 63, Cyprus from 1966, and Egypt from 1973 to 1974. So on behalf of myself and my family, as my father was also a United Nations peacekeeping mission, I'd like to thank you gentlemen all very much. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to continue along with what our Parliamentary Secretary for Military Affairs, the member from Fredericton-Silverwood, has organized today, I too am pleased to rise and introduce two peacekeepers from the riding of New Maryland, Sunbury West, and from Oromocto. David Cook from Nova Scotia is currently a resident of Rissigornish, served with the Royal Canadian Signals from 1956 to 1968, and United Nations peacekeeping mission in Congo, Africa in 1962, and his wife Sandra. Also, I'd like to introduce John Perry from Summerside, PEI, who's a resident of Oromocto, New Brunswick, served with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps from 1954 to 1976, United Nations peacekeeping mission in Egypt in 1956 to 57, and also a tour in Germany. So again, on behalf of all of our residents, we'd like to say welcome and thank you for all that you've done and that you continue to do.
New York North.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize three distinguished gentlemen from my riding and thank them for their contributions, past and present. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Gerald Dextres, originally from Rimouski, Quebec, resident of Limekiln, New Brunswick, that's just outside of Stanley, served with the Royal Canadian Air Force from 1965 to 1990, United Nations peacekeeping mission in Egypt from 1976 to 77. Jerry is an avid hockey player, poppy campaigner extraordinaire, and he, along with his wife Edie, are two of the driving forces behind the Stanley Fair, the oldest continually running fair in Canada, I might add. So, Jerry, we certainly want to thank you for all your contributions. Thank you very much for being here today. Mr. Speaker, Mr. John Lomax, originally from Toronto, Ontario, resident of Stanley, New Brunswick, served with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps from 1950 to 1969, United Nations peacekeeping missions in Korea from 1954 to 55, and in Egypt 1966-67. John has long been associated with our local home care organization, Nashwaak Outreach, and is known far and wide as a great cook, having worked in that capacity for the Nashwaak Villa for many years. John, great to have you here today. Thank you very much. I understand that Mr. Fred Ryan was not able to be here today, but I still wanted to recognize him in the House. From Bona Vista, Newfoundland, resident of Nashwaak Bridge, served with the Royal Canadian Dragoons from 1959 to 65, United Nations peacekeeping mission in Egypt from 62 to 63. Fred is well known as a great crane operator and as a driving force behind the annual memorial service at Pleasant Valley, recognizing the efforts of the 42nd Highland Regiment to help settle this region, our region, and this province. And as a direct descendant of 8 of those 42nd Highlanders, I wanted to thank Fred for his contributions, and to Mr. Dextras and Mr. Lomax, if you make it to Beaverbrook Branch 80 before I do, pass along my best to Fred. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise in the House today to introduce to the House Mr. Alan Bowie. Mr. Bowie, originally from Antigonish, Nova Scotia, now a resident of Sussex Corner, New Brunswick, served with Royal Canadian Engineers from 1967 to 1996. United Nations peacekeeping missions in Egypt in 1973, 1974, Golan Heights in 1985 and 1989, 1988 to 1989. Mr. Bowie is often found at the Sussex Legion, number 20, volunteering at many events, and certainly a pleasure for me to stand in the House today to introduce Mr. Bowie. Also, Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to the House Mr. Ralph LeBlanc. From Sussex, New Brunswick, resident of Nakawik, New Brunswick, served with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, United Nations peacekeeping mission in Egypt, 1962-1963. Welcome to you both, and thank you.
Member from Hampton Kings. Hampton Kings.
Mr. Speaker, already today the member for Fredericton has introduced the individual from my riding who has served his community and his country for a very long time. I've known Bob B.A. for a number of years, and Bob has got a big heart, and he's very, very concerned mostly about youth, making sure that they recognize the service given by everybody in the past, by our veterans, and making sure they have opportunities in the future. He's very instrumental in the cadet movement, the Army Cadet Corps in Kingston, and he has provided every opportunity for them to succeed. Bob is a first-class citizen of this country, and I'm very proud to know him and support him in all his efforts. And I want to recognize Bob today. Thank you for being here, Mr. B.A.
Member from Charlotte Campobello.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too am quite honored to stand here today and welcome a couple guests, Joe Corbin and his beautiful wife, Marilyn. Joe, from St. Leonard MB, now is a resident of St. Andrews, served with the Royal Canadian Signals from 1956 to 1965, United Nations peacekeeping mission in Congo, Africa in 1964. We got to know both of them in the past 2 or 3 years, very, very good friends, and I'm very honored to stand here today and say thank you for not only what you do for your country, your community, and your province. Thank you. Well, I'm on my feet here. I have a couple others. Burton Guptill and his wife Elizabeth Guptill's here today. From Grandmanan NB originally, resident of St. John, New Brunswick, served with Royal Canadian Army Service Corps 1955 to 1970. United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in Cyprus in 1964 to 65. He also served in Germany. We're very lucky, fortunate to have you guys, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you for what you've done for this country.
Minister of Energy and Mines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It certainly is a privilege and an honor to stand today to recognize some of our guests here that reside in my riding of Fredericton Lincoln. And I think it's very valid to point out how peacekeeping, it's an act that frankly, through the work of our guests here, they've been able to take the act of peacekeeping and make it a Canadian trait known worldwide because of the fine work that they've done throughout the years. I have three individuals here that I'd like to recognize. The first is Andy LaBelle. Andy is originally from Shawinigan, Quebec. He's a resident of Lincoln, and he served with the Royal Canadian Engineers from 1960 to 1987. Also on United Nations peacekeeping missions in Egypt in 1963 and 64, and in Cyprus in 1971. And Andy, certainly I see him quite often at the community breakfasts in Lincoln, where he is always a willing volunteer, so it's always a pleasure to see him. Jerry DeVoe from Middleton, Nova Scotia, is a resident of Fredericton, served with the Royal Canadian Engineers from 1968 to 2009. United Peacekeeping Mission in Pakistan in 1990 and Rwanda in 1994, excuse me. And Robert Terry. Robert's originally from London, England, and served with the Royal Canadian Signals from 1957 to 1986. Also on United Nations peacekeeping missions in Congo in 1961, Egypt 1963-64, and in Cyprus in 1976 and 77. And to all of you, I want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for everything that you've done for
Minister of Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's certainly a pleasure to rise today and with my colleagues to congratulate and welcome the individuals that we have here today from the Blue Helmets. Certainly no words can express the thanks that we give to all our servicemen and women, both past and present. But I'd like to welcome John Giovanetti today, originally from Donkin Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, but now a resident of Fredericton and Nashwaaksis. John served with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps from 1951 to 77, 26 years, Mr. Speaker. And John was involved in United Nations peacekeeping missions in Egypt and Gaza in 1962, Cyprus in 1967 and 68, and Egypt in 1974 and 75, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, before we are done here this morning, I would like to recognize one more individual, member of the Blue Helmets, is a member of our Legislative Assembly here, our colleague, the member from Fredericton Silverwood. And the member from Fredericton Silverwood, originally from Calgary, Alberta, now obviously a resident here in Fredericton, New Brunswick, proud to say. That member served with the 3rd Royal Canadian Regiment from 1991 to 2003, and missions included Bosnia from 1997-98, Afghanistan in 2005, and again in Bosnia in 2001. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that anybody here in the Legislative Assembly knows that the member from Fredericton Silverwood is a very strong supporter and advocate, as many of us are, for our troops, both past and present, Mr. Speaker. And just to wrap up this morning, I'd like to ask all members of the Assembly to rise once again and thank the Blue Helmets that are here today for all your service, past and present. Thank you very much.